In an age of endless noise, where arguments erupt in comment sections and certainty shouts louder than truth, one ancient voice becomes more urgent than ever, the voice of Socrates. More than 2,000 years ago, he was called the wisest of the Greeks. Yet his wisdom began not with answers, but with ignorance. When the oracle at Delphi declared him the wisest, Socrates was puzzled. How could he be wise if he knew nothing? That paradox became the starting point of his philosophy, and the sting that still matters to us today. Because Socrates understood something we have almost forgotten, belief does not wait for proof. It springs up untested, unquestioned, and only later, if ever, do we bother to examine it. And that is why we live surrounded by illusions. Socrates was dangerous to Athens not because he gave answers, but because he asked questions. Questions that stripped away the comfort of easy certainty. Questions that forced people to see that much of what they called wisdom was only opinion, dressed up in confidence. His method, what we now call the Socratic method, was not a doctrine, not a set of rules, not even a philosophy in the ordinary sense. It was an activity, a dialogue, a way of thinking that begins with humility, the willingness to admit you might be wrong. And it was precisely that spirit that made him hated, because nothing is more frightening than having your cherished beliefs exposed as fragile. Today, we face a crisis of thought even deeper than Athens did. Our technology rewards outrage over reflection, certainty over doubt, and slogans over truth. Social media thrives on what Socrates warned against, the conceit of knowledge, the arrogance of thinking we know when we do not. The result? A culture addicted to opinions, allergic to questions, and hostile to dialogue. And yet, hidden in the ruins of our public discourse lies the same remedy that saved philosophy once before, the Socratic method, the gadfly sting, the examined life, the courage to ask questions without fear, and to receive them without offense. The world needed a Socrates then. It needs one now, perhaps more than ever. In ancient Greece, wisdom was not a matter of private reflection but a public spectacle. Poets, sophists, generals, and statesmen all claimed authority over truth. To be seen as wise was to wield power, and Athens was alive with voices competing for influence. It was in this world that the oracle at Delphi, speaking for the god Apollo, declared Socrates the wisest of the Greeks. Socrates himself was baffled by this prophecy. He did not consider himself wise. He knew only his own ignorance. But because he believed the gods could not lie, he felt compelled to test the meaning of the oracle's words. And so, he began his strange quest. He went to the men considered experts in their fields, politicians, poets, craftsmen, and he questioned them. Patiently, relentlessly, he drew out their assumptions, asking them to define what they claimed to know. What is justice? What is courage? What is piety? Again and again, their answers collapsed under examination. They spoke with confidence, but lacked true understanding. Their knowledge was borrowed, shallow, filled with contradictions. And slowly, Socrates realized what the oracle must have meant. He was wiser than they were not because he possessed answers, but because he did not pretend to know what he did not know. His wisdom was in his humility, in his awareness of ignorance. This realization became the seed of the Socratic method, a way of exposing false certainty, stripping away illusions, and revealing just how little we truly understand. But this was more than a technique. For Socrates, it was a way of life. To him, untested beliefs were dangerous because they shaped how people lived and governed. An unexamined conviction could lead to injustice, to arrogance, even to the destruction of the soul. And so he lived as a kind of gadfly, stinging the people of Athens out of complacency, urging them to awaken from a slumber of untested opinions. To the comfortable and the powerful, this questioning spirit was unsettling, even threatening. To those clinging to their own authority, Socrates was not a philosopher but a menace. Yet he would not stop. The oracle had set him on a path, and he would follow it wherever it led, even if it led, in the end, to his trial and death. As Socrates moved from one conversation to another, Athens began to take notice. His method was unlike the speeches of the sophists, who charged high fees to teach rhetoric and the art of persuasion. They gave answers polished for applause, while Socrates only asked questions that cut through the surface. He made no claims to wisdom, yet in every encounter he left others exposed, their ignorance revealed before an audience of bystanders. The politicians resented him for showing how little they understood the laws they passed. The poets grew uneasy when he asked them to explain the meaning of their own verses, exposing that their inspiration was more instinct than knowledge. Even the craftsmen, who excelled in their trades, faltered when Socrates asked if skill in one area gave them authority to speak on virtue or truth. Everywhere he went, Socrates left confusion in his wake, but also a spark of something greater, the possibility of genuine understanding. Yet this relentless questioning did not come without cost. Many of those he questioned grew hostile, feeling humiliated in public. They mistook his search for truth as mockery, his humility as arrogance, his persistence as defiance. Rumors spread that he twisted words, that he taught the young to disrespect their elders, that he turned noble values upside down. He was accused of being a sophist himself, though he took no payment, and unlike them, claimed to know nothing at all. But the youth of Athens loved him. They gathered around him in the marketplace, eager to witness his debates, laughing when a great man stumbled under the weight of his own contradictions. To the young, Socrates was a kind of liberator, a voice that freed them from the prison of blind tradition. Yet to the powerful, this influence was dangerous. Athens was already fragile, shaken by war, political upheaval, and the uncertainty of its future. The city longed for stability, not the endless disturbance of a gadfly asking uncomfortable questions. What began as a divine mission to test the oracle's words was now transforming into something larger, a challenge to the very way Athens thought about knowledge, virtue, and authority. Socrates did not set out to be a revolutionary. He only wished to uncover the truth. But the truth, when it stripped away illusions, was more radical than any ideology. And it was this radical spirit of questioning that would ignite the conflict leading to his downfall. The more Socrates questioned, the more dangerous he appeared to those invested in certainty. Athens was a city that prized its democracy and the voices of its citizens, but beneath the ideal lay a fragile ego. The powerful men of Athens could not tolerate the sting of public refutation, nor the laughter of the youths who gathered to watch their authority unravel under Socratic questioning. What they saw was not philosophy but subversion. Socrates' refusal to flatter or reassure made him appear alien to the political life of the city. He had no interest in wealth, power, or status. He owned little, walked barefoot, and spent his days in the public square, conversing with anyone who would listen. His loyalty was not to the city's traditions, but to a deeper mission, to awaken souls from the sleep of ignorance. But Athens was growing restless. The wounds of the Peloponnesian War still lingered, leaving the city weakened and bitter. Political factions fought for dominance, and suspicion haunted the air. Into this uncertainty, Socrates' questions landed like sparks in dry wood. When he exposed contradictions in a general's idea of courage or revealed a politician's ignorance about justice, it was not just a personal embarrassment. It was seen as an attack on the order of the city itself. The sophists, who sold clever arguments as a path to influence, despised him for ruining their trade. He mocked their pretense of wisdom and revealed their techniques as hollow persuasion. The poets resented being told they did not understand their own works, and the statesmen whispered that Socrates was poisoning the youth against tradition. Slowly, a narrative formed, that Socrates was impious, that he questioned the gods of Athens, that he replaced reverence with doubt. The young men who followed him, eager to imitate his method, sometimes wielded it carelessly, turning it into sport, mocking elders without Socrates' depth of purpose. This only deepened suspicion. To his enemies, Socrates became a corrupter, not a teacher. And yet he never stopped. His conscience would not allow him to retreat into silence. He believed it was his divine mission to challenge false wisdom wherever he found it. But with every question he asked, the resentment against him grew, until it became clear that Athens would one day demand a reckoning. The city could tolerate many things: defeat, hardship, even tyranny, but not the man who forced it to see its own ignorance. Even as resentment toward Socrates deepened, his method began to spark something profound in the minds of those who engaged with him sincerely. Unlike the sophists, whose words dissolved once the applause ended, Socrates left behind a lasting disturbance in the soul. His questions lingered long after the conversation was over, gnawing at the comfortable assumptions people carried. To those willing to endure the discomfort, the effect was transformative. His dialogues revealed that wisdom was not possession but pursuit, that virtue could not be reduced to slogans, and that to live without questioning was to live in blindness. Among the youth who gathered around him were men who would go on to shape philosophy and history, most notably Plato, who preserved Socrates' legacy in the dialogues that still challenge us today. These young Athenians saw in Socrates not a corrupter, but a guide who demanded that they examine their lives with honesty. He offered them no easy answers, only the discipline of thought, the courage to doubt, and the patience to search for truth. For some, this was intoxicating. To discover that the great men of Athens could not define justice or explain virtue was both shocking and liberating. It revealed that authority was not the same as knowledge, that tradition was not the same as truth. In Socrates' presence, the foundations of the world seemed to tremble, not because he tore them down, but because he showed that they had never been as solid as people believed. The first signs of change appeared in the way his students began to think differently. They questioned not to humiliate, but to understand. They turned their gaze inward, learning to test their own beliefs with the same rigor Socrates applied to others. To them, the oracle's proclamation became clear. Wisdom lies not in certainty, but in recognizing the limits of knowledge. And yet, these sparks of transformation came with a cost. The same qualities that inspired his followers also intensified the hatred of his enemies. For every student awakened by his questions, there was a leader who felt undermined, a sophist who felt exposed, a citizen who felt mocked. The change had begun, but it carried with it both promise and peril. Socrates was teaching Athens a lesson it was not ready to learn, that true wisdom is born from doubt, and that the examined life is the only life worth living. But transformation is never a straight path, and even those who admired Socrates often found themselves resisting him. His relentless questioning was like fire. It could illuminate, but it could also burn. Students who at first felt exhilarated by his wisdom sometimes recoiled when the questions turned inward, when their own beliefs, cherished traditions, or personal ambitions were stripped bare. To stand before Socrates was to be reminded that certainty is fragile, and not everyone could endure that revelation. Some accused him of being too harsh, of pulling down walls without offering anything to replace them. Others whispered that his refusal to provide clear answers meant he had none at all, that perhaps he was simply a destroyer of belief rather than a guide to truth. Even among his closest companions, doubt festered. To embrace his method meant to live in a state of perpetual questioning, never at rest, always unsettled. Many longed for comfort, for doctrines that could be held firmly, for leaders who spoke with assurance instead of riddles. The sophists, with their polished speeches and flattering certainties, seemed easier to follow, easier to admire. Against this backdrop, Socrates appeared maddening. His refusal to speak in absolutes felt to some like weakness, to others like arrogance. He insisted that he knew nothing, yet his questions dismantled the proudest thinkers of Athens. Was this not a kind of knowledge in itself? Doubt became the shadow that followed him everywhere. For his students, it was the doubt of whether they could endure the endless demand to question. For the city, it was the doubt of whether such a man was dangerous to order and tradition. Resistance rose not only from his enemies, but from within his circle, where frustration and fatigue sometimes overpowered admiration. Yet Socrates did not waver. He seemed to embrace resistance as part of the path. Truth, he believed, could only emerge when every false certainty was destroyed. But the more he persisted, the more he revealed the uncomfortable truth about Athens itself, that a city priding itself on democracy and wisdom might in fact be built on shallow foundations. Doubt and resistance grew together, feeding each other, pushing both Socrates and Athens closer to an inevitable confrontation. There comes a moment in every story where the ground shifts, where what was once tolerated can no longer be endured. For Socrates, that moment came slowly, yet with the force of inevitability. His questions, once seen as clever challenges, began to feel like open wounds upon the pride of Athens. The city that called itself the birthplace of freedom began to whisper that he was undermining its very foundation. He had humiliated too many powerful men in public, stripped too many politicians of their masks, and revealed too many truths that others wished had stayed buried. His refusal to flatter or compromise was no longer seen as noble. It was seen as dangerous. Rumor spread that he was corrupting the youth, filling their heads with ideas that weakened respect for tradition and authority. Parents, once proud that their son studied under Socrates, now feared that his teachings would estrange them from the gods and the city itself. Even his claim that he was guided by a divine inner voice, his daimonion, was twisted into evidence that he rejected the sacred beliefs of Athens. The turning point did not arrive with a single event, but with a gathering storm of resentment, suspicion, and fear. A democracy, for all its ideals, lives on the approval of the crowd, and Socrates had made too many enemies among both the powerful and the ordinary. The Peloponnesian War had left Athens humiliated and searching for someone to blame. In that climate of exhaustion and insecurity, Socrates became a convenient scapegoat. He stood as a mirror the city no longer wished to look into, and so the decision was made. He would be silenced. What began as doubt had hardened into accusation. What began as resistance had grown into trial. Athens, the city of philosophers, prepared to judge the one man who had dared to show it the truth about itself. The air was heavy with irony and tragedy, for in condemning him, Athens would reveal exactly the weakness he had always pointed out. The teacher who claimed to know nothing was about to expose, through his own fate, how little his city truly understood about justice, freedom, and truth. The courtroom was silent, yet it vibrated with tension. Hundreds of citizens had gathered, some out of hatred, some out of curiosity, and some because they sensed they were witnessing something larger than a trial. Socrates stood before them, not with fear, but with the same calm he had always carried in the marketplace. His accusers claimed he had corrupted the youth and rejected the gods of the city. Yet Socrates did not grovel, nor did he flatter the jury. Instead, he turned his defense into philosophy itself. He asked his judges the very questions they did not want to face. What is corruption? What is true piety? Is it better to live quietly in ignorance, or to disturb others by forcing them to examine their own lives? He declared that he had never taken money for his teaching, that his mission had been guided by a divine voice urging him to question, to challenge, and to awaken. He told them plainly that he would rather die than abandon this mission, for to stop questioning would be to betray his very soul. The deeper discovery was this: Socrates was not truly on trial. Athens was. He told them that by condemning him, they would harm themselves far more than they would harm him, for he was like a gadfly, stinging the great but sluggish horse of Athens to keep it awake. If they killed him, he warned, others would rise to take his place, and their slumber would not last. The jury expected fear, compromise, and pleading, but Socrates gave them none of these. Instead, he gave them a mirror, forcing them to confront their own cowardice, their desire for comfort over truth, and their preference for conformity over wisdom. It was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about what kind of city Athens wanted to be. Would it choose to embrace the uncomfortable pursuit of truth, or would it silence the voice that dared to remind it of its own ignorance? Socrates' words pierced the courtroom like arrows, yet even as he spoke, he knew the verdict had already been decided. Still, he pressed on, because for him, philosophy was not an argument to be won, but a way of living that demanded courage even in the face of death. And that is when the crowd began to see it. This trial was not an ending, but the beginning of something far greater. The moment the jury delivered its verdict, the air thickened with finality. Guilty, The word struck like a stone against the walls, yet Socrates did not flinch. In Athens, the accused was permitted to propose an alternative punishment, a chance to plead for exile, silence, or even a fine. But instead of begging for his life, Socrates did something that left the courtroom stunned. He suggested he should be rewarded, not punished, for his service to the city. He told the jury that he had lived not for wealth, not for power, but for the pursuit of truth, and that this devotion deserved honor, not death. The audacity of his words enraged some and bewildered others. When pressed, he calmly admitted that if exile were chosen, he would not stop questioning and teaching, because to live without philosophy was no life at all. He knew that in any city, his relentless questioning would bring the same hostility, for people everywhere resisted truth when it unsettled their illusions. As he spoke, the citizens realized the depth of his defiance. He would rather die than live in silence. The jury, offended by his refusal to repent, voted again, and this time the punishment was sealed: death by drinking poison hemlock. Many in the crowd gasped, for even those who despised him could not ignore the courage burning through his words. Socrates stood tall, as if the sentence was not a punishment but a final confirmation of his mission. His friends wept openly, begging him to recant, to accept exile, to choose life over principle. But to Socrates, this was the test of all tests, whether his philosophy was mere talk or a truth worth dying for. He reminded them that death was not to be feared, for no one truly knew what came after. Perhaps it was nothing but dreamless sleep, or perhaps it was a journey to another place, where he might continue his conversations with the souls of the dead. Either way, he welcomed it. For Socrates, the test was not survival, it was integrity. And in choosing to remain loyal to his calling even when the price was death, he revealed the power of a life lived with unshakable conviction. The city had condemned him, but in that very act, he became immortal. In the dim light of his prison cell, Socrates appeared not as a man condemned, but as one liberated. While his friends trembled in sorrow, he sat calmly, as though he were the teacher and they the ones on trial. Crito, his most loyal companion, pleaded with him to escape. Bribes had been arranged, a safe haven secured beyond Athens. Freedom was within reach if only he would grasp it. Yet Socrates refused. To flee, he explained, would mean betraying the very principles he had defended his entire life. If he escaped, what lesson would that teach? That philosophy was useful only when convenient, that justice was worth speaking of, but not worth living by. He reminded them that laws, however flawed, bound the city together, and to break them out of fear would be to corrupt his soul. His friends argued, wept, and cursed the injustice of Athens, but he remained unshaken. The unexamined life is not worth living, he had said in court, and now he embodied that truth more fully than ever. Death did not terrify him, for he saw it as the final journey, the ultimate mystery, the place where philosophy's questions might finally meet their answers. He told them that no harm could come to a just man, for while his body might perish, his soul would endure untarnished. Those who condemned him were the ones truly harmed, for in choosing to silence truth, they had wounded themselves far more than they wounded him. His calmness was unnerving, his acceptance almost unbearable to those who loved him. Yet in that stillness was the breakthrough. Philosophy was not abstract thought, but a way of living, even unto death. Socrates turned his final hours into a lesson on courage, justice, and the immortality of truth. His students realized that they were not merely witnessing the death of their teacher, they were witnessing the birth of a legend. In choosing death over compromise, Socrates showed them that wisdom was not about avoiding suffering, but about meeting it with dignity. That day, in the silence of a prison cell, philosophy ceased to be words and became flesh. And as they looked upon their teacher, awaiting the cup of poison, they understood. Some lives are so devoted to truth that even death cannot end them.